is a network of 26 public development banks. Our mission? Speaking with a common voice to leverage a greater impact in major international debates and to contribute to the implementation of the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome. I know it's Energy Day, so I'm sure everyone is very busy running from event to event and meeting to meeting, but thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. My name is Jonathan Tala. I'm the Senior Fund Manager for ETP. ETP is the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, and it is an innovative partnership that's set up in Southeast Asia by government and philanthropic funders as a pool fund. And we work in Southeast Asia, and we help our partner countries in Southeast Asia to accelerate sustainable energy transition. ETP is a technical assistance program that supports, again, countries in Southeast Asia with priority countries of Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines, with policy reform, with extending smart grids, with capacity building, and relevant to today's discussion, creating an enabling environment for de-risking investments for both energy efficiency and renewable energy financing to flow. I'm sure this is a number that you're all very, very well aware of, but the IEA estimates more than $1 trillion that is needed in renewable energy as investments in Southeast Asia alone before 2030 for Southeast Asian countries to achieve their NDCs under the Paris Agreement. But it's not just about the need for financing. There also needs to be an enabling environment for financing to flow for effective investment. If we fix this, then the financing will flow and can become effective for energy transition. This is what ETP does. We work with governments in the region to identify what those potential blockages are and how can we provide support to eliminate those blockages. In addition to technical assistance in this space, we offer grants for innovative mechanisms in energy efficiency in Southeast Asia. We build partnerships with organizations like the Southeast Asia Clean Energy Facility, or CSEF, who provide early-stage capital development investment into innovative, high-impact clean energy projects and businesses in critical Southeast Asian markets. Just a few minutes ago, we signed a MOU with PTSMI to support the government of Indonesia. PTSMI is the DFI under the Ministry of Finance and Government of Indonesia to lead on Indonesia's ETM, Energy Transition Mechanism, country platform. We all have a role to play in financing for energy transition. Today, we will hear about the role of concessional finance, the role of philanthropies, the role of private financiers, and the role of de-risking mechanisms. I want to thank the experts for being here today, for being a part of the panel, for your time, for your candor, and for sharing your lessons and perspectives with us. Thank you. I'm just going to ask Isabel to come up from Tara Climate Foundations.
Thank you all for coming. So I'm Isabelle de Lavinfos. I'm with the Tara Climate Foundation based in Singapore. We are a philanthropic re-granting foundation. We will have 4 panelists today, so please join me here. So we have, let me take my notes. We have Pradana Murthy from PTSMI, so an Indonesian development bank. He's the director for risk management. We have Sean de Montfort from Sequoia Climate Foundation, Program Manager for Climate Finance. We have Liz Bronder from the iTrust project, Managing Director for the iTrust project. And then we have Kelvin Fan from G-Fans. So we basically have on the panel representatives from the private sector, de-risking mechanism, philanthropies, and development institution in Indonesia. So different roles that they play. And I will let them to introduce themselves and their organization. So I would like to hear from all of you, and I will start with Pradana. I would really like to hear from you what your organization does. So what source of finance do you bring in energy transition? in Southeast Asia, just to understand where that money is from and what is attached to it. So what's your driver in those investments, and try to present how you collaborate with other organizations, financial organizations around the panel or elsewhere, and if you can point to a specific examples of that collaboration, and I will ask you all to do that as well. Thank you, Pradhan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, UNOPS, for inviting us. And I and we from SMI celebrates the new MOU that we just been signed, and we hope that this leads to many projects and many initiatives that is going to push and accelerate energy transition in Indonesia. I'm in PT SMIs. Basically, we are, as Isabel mentioned, DFI, local DFI, or National Development Bank. We are a corporations under the Ministry of Finance, so we are fully state-owned. Our size is currently around 7.6 billion US dollar worth of assets. Just like to show that our main activity is providing financing and investment in private sectors. 2/3 of our operations are in the private sectors at the moment, and the rest 1/3 is in the public sectors, because we as NDBs also provide local government financing or municipal financing. So this all activity of ours are related to our mandate to actually push development agenda of Indonesia through providing various innovative financing solutions. So how we actually do that, we often collaborated with public sectors as well as private sectors, MDBs, bilateral agencies, donors, philanthropy. So we collaborated with all, trying to approach a program or a transactions in a blended finance mindset that presented an opportunity for all stakeholders to be part of the activity or transactions. So we have been doing that since actually the first structured finance that we've done is 1 year into our operations. So we were established 2009, and the first structured finance deals that involve senior loan, mezzanine loan, as well as equity financing is in 2010. So we this is in our DNA from the start, blended finance. And SMI has been doing that ever since. Back in 2018, we launched SDG Indonesia One blended finance platform, basically to try to mobilize all source of capitals, either through our balance sheet or off balance sheet in a co-financing manner, to SDG related projects, including renewable energy. So we have so far participated in 1 gigawatt worth of renewable energy projects. I know that seems to be not a lot, but the number of projects involved is more than 30. So I think that reflects that the opportunity in Indonesia with the widespread of archipelago. We are 17,000 islands, 6,000 of which is inhabited. So these are the opportunity and challenges that presented in Indonesia, including the size of renewable energy projects that's presented in Indonesia. So a lot of that is being done in the blended finance manner, and I will stop there first. I can tell about it later.
Thank you. Sean, philanthropies, funding in blended finance. So what is your role? What is the role of philanthropies, and any example of how you've collaborated with others?
Sure. Thanks very much, Isabel. It's great to be here. So I'm Sean de Montfort from Sequoia Climate Foundation. We're a large US-based philanthropy with a mission solely focused on near-term emissions reductions, and we fund where we believe we'll see impacts by 2030, so with a near-term frame. We generally assess our grant-making opportunities through four criteria and lenses. Those are scale, speed, cost or leverage, and likelihood of success. And for us and our board, leverage is a really key component of that, because if we think of the 4 to 6 trillion US dollars of finance required for the transition, and the roughly 4 to 6 billion of climate mitigation philanthropy available, that's 1,000 to 1 ratio that we generally look for in our investments. And obviously that's a science that can't always be achieved when we think about grant making, but it's what we strive for. We operate across major emitters, but also have some cross-cutting programs. So we have a China and Southeast Asia program, most relevant for this conversation, India program, a US program, a Europe program, a Brazil program, and then also a global climate finance program, which I sit in, a communications and movements program, and then an oil and gas program. And each of those last three is global in nature and scope. I mean, on this specific question around blended finance, there's lots of people turning to philanthropy as the answer, right? Particularly when it comes to the provision of concessionary financing, of entering the capital stack in some way to offset the risk. I mean, I think our view at this point, but it's an evolving conversation, is that the amount of climate philanthropy available is frankly peanuts relative to what's required in those deal structures. And I mentioned that leverage ratio, right? And for us, it's not been clear yet to our board that that can be achieved through participation in these financing structures. That being said, there's so much innovation in this space, and it's not something we'd rule out. It's just that we need the evidence to be able to do that, and we're working on exploring that. Maybe just a couple of reflections specifically on Southeast Asia. And then perhaps I can speak a little later about our global finance program. So in Southeast Asia, this is a growing focus for us at Sequoia, particularly Indonesia and Vietnam, as well as South Korea and Japan. It's clearly a critical time for the region to deploy renewables at scale, upgrade the grid, and avoid coal to gas lock-in. So our philanthropic investments in this space are largely focused on power sector decarbonization and the implementation of credible and ambitious policy frameworks around that. So we work very closely with Tara Foundation on strengthening the role of civil society in this space, with ETP, of course, on building a sort of technical assistance support function for governments. And we've supported CSEF as well on building the project pipeline for renewable infrastructure. And maybe the last comment I'd make on the international side is, of course, we have the JETPs and China increasing its investment commitments, particularly in Indonesia with the 54 billion US dollar pledge and contract with PLN. So we're working to support the implementation on both sides of that and working closely with international partners on that.
Thank you very much for having us here today. So my name is Liz Bronder. I'm the managing director of a new initiative called iTrust. iTrust is a new financial vehicle that is intended to address a very specific risk that we feel is keeping the energy transition from accelerating and scaling. And that risk is the payment risk that the off-taker, the energy buyer, has vis-a-vis the independent power producers in the countries. And the iTrust vehicle is based on a successful model that was implemented in Argentina about 7 years ago, Renovar, and the way that and Argentina is a tricky market, as people know, so that in order to attract investors long-term into the renewable energy sector, it required backstopping of the payment risk of CAMESA, the off-taker at the time. So there are two, and this is a replication of that, and the founders of the organization that sponsors iTrust we're in the Ministry of Energy in Argentina and really ran the program. I was the regional director for Latin America for IFC, part of the World Bank Group at the time, and supported them in that effort. So we're basically trying to replicate what was successful in Argentina to the rest of the world, including in Southeast Asia. And the risk is really twofold. One is that despite the basic necessity of electricity, the off-taker does not always pay on time, and this creates a lot of uncertainty for the power producers, and they price that in and they make it very expensive when they offer contracts to the off-taker. So part of the de-risking tool is a liquidity facility that essentially guarantees to pay the power producers on time every month and collects back several months later from the off-taker. And this is a revolving facility that in Argentina was put together 100% or funded 100% by the government, but that's not very efficient and not very welcome by the governments. And so we are basically raising funding to pre-position that in a fund structure that's based in Luxembourg so that any emerging market government that follows bankability criteria for their auctions can embed it up front in their auction documents, and the bidders on those auctions will know that they'll have certainty that they will be paid on time, and that reduces a lot of the risk that they see. Then there's a second element, which was also present in the Renovar program, which is a partial risk guarantee for early termination. So if there is really an event of default and the government stops paying, but yet there's still substantial investment in assets in the country, the IPPs have the right to require the government to take the assets from them and pay them the asset value. And some IPPs, this gives great comfort to, and others don't need it, so it's voluntary. But in the case of Argentina, it was provided by the World Bank, and they provided a $750 million guarantee, and it essentially catalyzed $8 billion of energy investments from the IPPs in the country. And the impact that it had was to take the energy matrix in the country from 0% renewable energy to up to 32% in peak times. In a country that was, despite its richness in oil and gas, was still importing fuel and subsidizing fuel. So it also relieved billions of dollars of government spending every year. And this is a model that can be replicated in other countries. There are a number of countries in Asia and throughout the world that are trying to accelerate their energy transition, but they're not finding a way of attracting that private investment. And we believe that having this kind of vehicle in place that is actually funded by a whole host of potential interested parties, including the government themselves, including catalytic capital from some of the climate foundations, including the MDBs and DEC5s that are also trying to find ways to ensure that energy transition, particularly as part of the JET-P processes, can participate. But to make it efficient, there's also a standby letter of credit that can be provided by a commercial bank that hopefully will never be used, but that would be part of the depth of support that would be behind the off-taker's obligations. And so we feel that this is, and we've been speaking with a number of interested investors in this, and they also say it's a gap. We talked to MIGA and they say, yes, this is actually a gap in the market. We don't do liquidity, and somebody should be doing that. So we feel that there's a need for this, and that it would really help to catalyze more private investment in the energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Kelvin, good segue to private sector, private financial institutions, GFANs, and so obviously introduce, but then if you have some reflections on what Liz said, if you see that the financial institutions that you are talking to with in Southeast Asia, whether you see that this facility would really be a game changer.
Yeah, thank you. Just as an introduction, so my name's Kelvin. I'm from the Asia Pacific Network of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or in short, GFANZ. Just a brief introduction. So GFANZ is a coalition of net zero committed financial institutions. We have 8 sector-specific net zero alliances under the GFANZ umbrella, with the 9th one just launched yesterday, which is the export credit agencies. So it's important to note that when we talk about mobilizing finance, it's really the sort of financial institutions themselves who are at the heart of driving this mobilization. And how GFANZ thinks about this as a first step, if we have to take it all the way, as a step back, is to think about what's the overall sort of transition plan and financing strategies of financial institutions. And GFANZ last year at COP published a report on a voluntary guidance on how do you think about transition planning and the kind of framework for financial institutions, in which we identified 4 key financing strategies. So the first 2 are around the sort of green sort of investments. Right? First is around climate solutions. How do you scale those kind of early stage technologies such that they are at commercial scale and viability to be deployed? Second is around entities or companies that are already aligned with, for example, a science-based 1.5 pathway. The other 2 strategies are a little bit more on the brown to green. So the third one is on the aligning sort of entities. So companies who today are not necessarily fully aligned yet, but are trying to shift their portfolio to get there. And the last part is on managed phase out, which is an interesting topic perhaps. I'll leave it a little bit later. We just launched a paper on how do you actually approach financing the managed phase out of coal-fired power plants in Asia Pacific. But going back to the sort of 4 key financing strategies, I know we're going to talk about a little bit more on project financing, risk, and so on in today's discussion. But I think from the private financier's perspective, it's important to know that when we talk about project financing, ultimately it's part of an overall relationship with, for example, the real economy actor themselves. And so the engagement process is an ongoing one. It starts way before sort of, start even thinking about a particular project. And it's important to know that because as part of that conversation, that then ties into how a financier actually allocates capital across the 4 key financing strategies. Right? And then as we then go into specific kind of projects, that's where different financial institutions and different sorts of sources of capital, concessional capital, would then come into the picture. And I think one of the great things Liz brought up in terms of the different mechanisms that were available, that's actually quite key, because as we think about not just managed phase out, but even the broader energy transition, and we think about renewable projects, well, we all know that, for example, solar and wind, the levelized cost of electricity is low. That's the average number, right? But as you look into different jurisdictions, there is a difference. It could be influenced by whatever fossil fuel subsidies and all. And therefore, the bankability of different projects would be different. And that's where, the different kind of de-risking mechanisms come in. Because I think there's a lot of capital waiting on the sidelines, right? I think people want to invest, but depending on whether you're a local financier or you're more kind of multinational financier, you have a different perception of the risk, right? And I think that's where different players need to come together, the local FIs, the MDBs, the internationals, and the sort of other concessional capital to come in to actually think about how do you then address each tranche of risk, right, in a differential manner, such that the overall blended risk starts to go down and unlock the bankability of projects. And then you get the whole wave of capital mobilization. So I think at the end of the day, it's an equation where I think each kind of financier has a role to play in the capital stack. And I think that is definitely one of the important things of the mechanisms that Liz mentioned. Right, so I'll probably pause here so that we can kind of move on with the interesting questions to come.
Thank you. So let's try to drill down in Southeast Asia specifically. So Liz, you've mentioned that you are coming to Southeast Asia, so I will want to hear from you which markets are you coming into, which governments have you been talking to, where you see that there is an interest. Pradana, I would really be interested in how you. So, do you see that those risks? How do you see those risks in Indonesia in the projects you have done, especially looking at renewable energy projects? I think we can focus on these. So, you've mentioned that 1 gigawatt of renewables with 30 projects. What are these? Are there solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, what sort of projects, to try to really understand so the risks, the off-taker risk and the early termination risks are valid in Indonesia, but are these the main risks, or are there other risks like regulatory risk, policy risks, that are also important and bring some of the costs? And Sean, I will bring you into think grants and philanthropies. What are the best place to de-risk? So are there some of the risks that you think the grants can actually help because you're best positioned to do it? And whether these are financial risk or whether they're basically non-financial risk. I see, in the region, philanthropies are very active in engaging with civil society organizations, communities. That's a risk as well. It's not a financial risk, but it comes as a sort of delivery implementation risk. So that's sort of the traditional play, but maybe in the financial risk there are some risks that you can take as well. So if we can go around, maybe Pradana, I'll turn to you first. Talk about in Indonesia these renewables projects. What are the key risks? Do you see iTrust coming in, helping? Do you see grants coming in where they can help? And then I think private sector, as you've already a lot of experience. And then I will bring to Liz.
Thank you. I think in terms of the risk profile of projects in Indonesia, particularly renewable energy, I think if we want to sum up the level of risks involved, pretty much relatively the same of our sovereign risk, basically. So if you want to simplify it, it's like that. But I think because we are from a local financial perspective, we have a deeper understanding of the risk profiles involved. I think the types of risks in renewable energy is everywhere is the same. Regulatory risks, off-taker risks, feedstock supply risks, technological risks. It's all the same. Land acquisitions. So I think it's a matter of how we can actually first educate ourselves, because each of the subsectors of renewable energy is presenting to a different types of risk profile. And second is how to actually help developers to improve their project documentations in a way which is bankable. So that's two key strategies and approach that we have to adopt in all of our transactions, regardless of the actual risks involved in each project. So this is where the blended finance comes in and becomes critical. We receive a lot of technical assistance. This is actually the most utilized facilities in our blended finance platforms. We have, like I said, SDG Indonesia One platforms. Technical assistance has been critical in informing us as well as preparing the developer. So out of the more than 30 projects that we have involved in, the majority of that is hydro. Why hydro is becoming the most mature at the moment in Indonesia renewable energy sector is because of the view that PLN, our state-owned electricity company, the single biggest off-taker in Indonesia, a view of hydropower. Hydropower is basically a baseline source of power. So this is critical to PLN strategy, basically. So that's why if we look at the scale of importance and the opportunity that's presented on the grounds, I think hydro is top, of the list in Indonesia. That's reflected in the types of PPAs. We don't often see take and pay in hydro. Most of the cases are take or pay. And as we go to the other sectors, the other baseline power supply potentials is coming from geothermal, yeah. And we have executed financial transactions in a couple of them already. So geothermal is a bit tricky. There's a lot of project development effort needs to go into that, particularly the explorations stage. Yeah. So although it's a baseline potential, but the amount of efforts needs to go in before it can actually go live on the grid is actually sometimes it's more than even the hydro, which involve land acquisition as well. Yeah. So a lot of de-risking needs to happen in the geothermal exploration sectors, and we have collaborated with World Banks and other donors trying to come up with facility to de-risk exploration stage. Yeah. So that's what we are doing in geothermal, and we also finance solar PV, wind, and biomass. All have a different risk profile as well. So, but the same approach applies basically. Yeah. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
That's a bit surprising because I keep hearing that the risks are different for different types of renewables, and your message is it's the same risks. So that's an interesting experience. Liz, you're coming into Southeast Asia. Is Indonesia a country where you're planning to come first? Where are you coming, and where do you see the opportunities?
So I would say there are country selection criteria that identify where a product like iTrust would be most helpful. First of all, there are some government policy issues. For example, you have to allow for private investment and private ownership. That's not always the case. This is designed to try to drive transparency and competition in the market. And so it's designed to be used in auction processes so that there is this, transparent tender process where you can try to drive down prices because you will have more people trying to bid for the right to supply the electricity to the off-taker. If there isn't if it's project by project, we're trying to get away actually from project by project because that's so cumbersome to design, build, and then finance after the fact. It just takes a long time. So having a financing mitigation strategy up front allows for banks who are the financiers of the IPPs to understand their risks a little bit better. And so having a government that has the willingness to do this kind of scalable auction is part of the success of the program. And so there's the need for the government to be willing to also contribute to the liquidity facility. It's very important for operators and financial institutions to see that the government is going to back up the off-taker when needed, and so their money would be used first, and then there would be other catalytic capital that would be drawn on afterwards if needed. And so this is some of the considerations. And so the the advisory arm of the iTrust RELP organization is really working directly with governments to provide help in structuring the auctions, and then this would become one of the elements that's part of the documentation process.
Thank you. Sean, I'll turn to you now. Talk about philanthropies and these risks. So, what are your take on Southeast Asia and where you come in?
Sure, sounds good. I should say I'm not an energy transition specialist, which is a confession for Energy Day. I'm a financial regulator by background, which might seem a little far away. But maybe I can speak a little bit about our global climate finance strategy, which we run, and its application within the region, because there are some particular textures to that, which I think will kind of answer your question. So there are kind of really three components of it. The first is on producing better data on financing needs. So how do we break down these very top-level aggregated figures that we all have in our slide decks and so on around the financing needs for the transition into something that's more decision useful ultimately for both providers of capital but also policymakers with specific detail across geographies, sectors, solutions, and indeed the form of financing best placed to meet those needs, public versus private, debt versus equity, or concessionary, and so on. And of course that will help financial institutions to allocate capital more efficiently, but also policymakers to identify the exact, hone in more precisely on exact gaps and work better to create, the enabling environment to fill those gaps in a much more targeted way. By necessity, this element of the strategy is sort of geographically specific. So, we're fortunate at Sequoia to only work in a handful of geographies, so we can do that in a more targeted way. The second piece is on the private finance ecosystem, which speaks to much of the work Kelvin and his colleagues at GFANZ have been doing. But how do we create comprehensive frameworks for net zero alignment across all asset classes, but also broader kind of ancillary service providers, whether it's the auditors or the legal professionals or the ratings providers, all of these other pieces of the ecosystem that are sort of hardwired into how capital is allocated by financial institutions, but are often handbrakes in how they, in the level of ambition within their strategies. But within that, there's this tension between global decarbonization pathways used as the basis for those frameworks versus integration of national or regional specific pathways. And how do we both build consensus across large international financial institutions to use those global pathways, yet not to do so in a way that unfairly penalizes certain geographies or corporates and projects operating in geographies that may have different pathways that are determined by their governments. So that's something we and a few other funders are thinking quite carefully about, because we've funded the creation of this ecosystem. So how do we make sure it works in a way that's fit for purpose across all key geographies? There's then the question of which has come up on kind of how engagement with sovereigns and with state-owned enterprises. What does investor stewardship in that context look like? And ASCOR and others have done some good work in that space, but obviously that's a particular challenge or question in this region. And then on carbon markets, we're supporting work through the ICVCM on the supply side to create the appropriate sort of integrity framework for that, and welcome the work that Kelvin's been doing in the region on managed phase out too. So the third and final piece of our strategy at the global level, which is the most exciting bit for me as a financial regulator, is on policy and regulatory reform. But also for Sequoia, most of our interventions are focused on this topic. And there's three sort of sub-elements to this. Firstly, on systematic integration of climate risk into financial regulation. Disclosure, transition planning, and so on. But specifically when we think about Southeast Asia, a big part of this is on capacity building. So how do we work with partners to support integration and adoption of international frameworks to ensure that corporates in the region can attract international capital through harmonizing and aligning, whether it's with the ISSB or some of the international transition plan frameworks and so on. But also making sure that as we raise the ambition, for example, on prudential rules, so rules that require insurers and banks to hold certain amounts of capital to manage risk, how do we make sure those aren't ratcheted up in a way that starves the flow of capital to emerging markets? Any finance people, when it's Solvency II is a challenge here. So again, it's sort of how do we avoid some of these unintended consequences of global strategies not working in a way that doesn't work for the region. The second piece on accountability. So how do we raise accountability for climate action by non-state actors, alignment of NDCs with transition plan targets and ambition. There's some work, the UNFCCC at this COP on the recognition and accountability framework, which is looking at this exact topic. What's the role of governments in setting expectations of the private sector in and around this? And of course, there's work on the common taxonomy across ASEAN. And we're working with Sustainable Finance Institute Asia on providing a kind of secretariat function to support that. And then the last piece is on the enabling macroeconomic policy environment and sort of regulatory reform to enable climate finance, both within and into emerging markets, including Southeast Asia.
That's a lot of pieces. I need a medication.
Yes.
You need to do some capacity building for me to understand the different pieces and how they fit together. So, just mindful of the time, any questions from the audience? We have a limited audience, but any questions from the audience? Anybody wants to ask any burning question? Yes? Yeah. Should we use our mics or? Yeah, so there's a question here.
Thank you so much for all your interventions. It was a great panel discussion.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sarah Bendaou. I work at the Institute for Climate Economics, a think tank based in France, and I'm part of the development finance team. I was just wondering whether any of you would have a view on the importance of the different levels of commitment that we can have at the government level, at the entity level, when we engage with IPPs, for example, at the asset level, on what, in your view, would be the most important success factors, and if you can perhaps elaborate a bit more on that. Thank you.
Anybody wants to pick?
Maybe I can go first and pass around. So I like the framing that you had on the government entity and asset, because that actually points directly to our recommendations and how we frame them in the managed phase-out report. And
Did
so
you come together?
Oh, maybe we had a little bit of a
stage question.
Yeah, but as part of the recommendation, we think of financing the managed phase-out, and I guess in general the energy transition in 3 steps, right? The first step is on credibility, which talks about the government entity and asset level, what a financier needs to see in terms of those considerations. And then the other 2, just to finish the framing, second is on how do you actually optimize meaningful outcomes, be it from a climate impact perspective, from a socioeconomic inclusivity perspective, and also from a holistic financial viability. So not just the capital stack, but as well as what sort of financing that you require to actually enable the inclusivity components. And then the last part is on transparency and how do you actually ensure that when you talk about the transition itself, be it a managed phase-out or a renewable energy project, that when you want to actually phase it out by whatever 2030, that it actually happens, right? So that's a part on transparency. But going back to the consideration, so I think a couple of things that are important to see as quote-unquote commitments or clear signals. I think at the government level, like what Sean mentioned, I think there needs to be quite clear signals in terms of the overall energy transition plan. Because that's, at the end of the day, this is part of an overall energy transition and you are part of the overall plan, right? And having a direction on where the jurisdiction wants to actually go in the short term, in the medium term, how the energy mix actually changes, what's the kind of strategy to get there, only then can the rest of the private sector as well as the real economy actors actually fall in place to change their portfolio to support the overall kind of plan. Right, and as we talk about that, maybe just to borrow a few examples from the managed phase-out paper that we talk about. So specifically on the managed phase-out, a couple of important things is, as we think about decarbonizing and as we think about the early retirement of a plant, because one of the things that would be good to see is that you don't kind of have another plant popping up, because that's just removing one and kind of setting up another one, which is kind of a net, no change kind of scenario, right? But I think more importantly, that's the, well, some people term it as the no new coal. Right, and then there's another sort of commitment that would be a little bit more useful, which is other than stopping the sort of increase in new coal plants, to actually think about how do you actually decarbonize the existing fleet as well. Right, those sort of considerations are useful both at the government level as part of a energy transition plan, but also the entity level. So if you are a power producer who today has a coal fleet and you are looking for financing, how do you demonstrate that you're actually pivoting your portfolio as part of an aligning company to a portfolio that's a bit more green? So, freeing up capital that today you might have in fossil kind of plants to something that's a little bit more green. right? And I think as part of that, it's important to bring in the inclusivity aspect as well, because I think like what Liz mentioned, we need to bear in mind that there's a temporal element to it, right? There is a little bit of a upfront kind of financing that you require, not just for building out of the different investments that you and assets that you need, but also to think about how do you retrain the current workforce, how do you have the subnational programmatic elements towards retraining the entire workforce to fall in place to support the new green economy. So I think those are some commitments slash signals slash kind of expectations that you need at both the government and entity level. And I guess maybe just on the sort of asset and other considerations, I'll let the rest of the panelists talk about it.
We actually have to wrap up, so I'm going to ask the last question to all of you. Building on the point of the importance of the government engagement, you all mentioned that. So, government funding, state government funding, you need the government engaged, you need to partner. So, question, out of the political commitments, political announcements that you've heard at COP over the last 5 days, depends how long you have been here. I've been here 6 days, so I've heard a lot of them. Out of these political commitments that you've heard, which is the one that you think is the most catalytic for energy transition in Southeast Asia?
I would say carbon. Yeah, carbon because we know that government fiscal space are limited. Government needs to crowd in private investment. Yeah. That's where the money is. Yeah. We need something credible, to actually crowd in private investment, and carbon is one of the. If we are talking at the global stage, this is that's the most potential to actually create credibility in asset classes. So when we are hearing that a carbon methodology has been announced for public consultations in coal transition, say for example, I think this is quite a huge step that we are having high hopes for that. Yeah, and I hope people's like Vera and gold standards don't mess it up. So basically, they can actually create this asset class. Yeah. So I think that's one big important thing. And of course, we've been hearing that countries will actually increase their renewable energy portfolio threefold by 2030. Yeah, I think there's some massive ambitions, but we are in there. As we know, that the challenges are very big. Yeah, and we still needs a blended finance approach to mobilize all stakeholders involved. We know that. The majority of the money is in the senior loan and equity fund. Yeah, I think we have a small minority in technical assistance and grants. Yeah, but having those being involved in transactions, they will create credibility. Again, the keywords will be credibility. Yeah. So I think that's my point.
Thank you, Sean. Sean, what you've heard, political commitments, announcements, which is a...
Yeah, very quickly. So I'd say the pace of progress on the MDB reform and IMF reform agenda, I think it's moved so much more quickly than anyone foresaw. And the other thing which Kelvin mentioned is the launch of the Net Zero Export Credit Agency Alliance, which we've been seed funding and I think could be a real game changer.
So I just want to underscore some of the other comments here because the challenge, there are a lot of commitments that are being made. I mean, this is COP and the governments are all next door making these commitments. But it's really the timing and the pace. And where are the very short-term decisions being made that will be game changers? And I think that some of these products, and I agree with you also about MDB reform. There is a strong recognition that if we don't change the financial incentives for investment in energy transition, it won't happen. And so, that I have actually found very encouraging.
Oh, I guess one of my last words is I agree with all the announcements that the previous panelists have made. And in particular, I think the headline one was on the tripling of the renewable energy. I think that's the important kind of goal that we need to go towards. I think the other thing, maybe just to round off the sort of different announcements I've heard, is on blended finance and concessional capital. So maybe just a little bit of a plug for the Singapore side, since I'm part of the delegation. I mean, they announced this program called the FAST-P. And basically that's the sort of concessional financing mechanism where they have $5 billion of capital. I think the key part of that is how they can take a programmatic approach with a vehicle to actually insert some concessional finance to de-risk some of this kind of investments in, as I mentioned, a little bit on climate solutions, a little part on the kind of managed phase out, but also replacing with clean energy replacements, and a couple of others on renewable energy ramp up. So I think you need kind of these different pieces to actually hit that overall goal on the renewable energy tripling and all those sort of things. So all these pieces needs to come together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, do you want to have the last words and closing remarks? Yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to keep it short. It's a really interesting discussion. I think there's a lot of points. I think, Kelvin, when that paper comes out that you've mentioned that GFANS is putting out, I think we would all be very interested to read it, so please do share it with us. And Sean, ETP does a lot of capacity building programs. We would love your input to, echoing Isabel's words, if we can, if we can build that also for ourselves, because there are a lot of pieces. So I think there's a lot of challenges that the panel has outlined today, and a lot of different opportunities. But I think the one thing that keeps coming out is that it's not just the investments, but it's everybody, bringing everybody around the table. It's that collaboration of many different pieces that you just mentioned, right? And then before we can, as we talk about unlocking private investments on a grand scale, I think we also need to review how we manage risk, how we approach the environment, the enabling environment, the regulatory frameworks that will allow even innovative mechanisms, like you mentioned, Liz, to be successful and to generate more renewable energy in the region. But to wrap it up, I think thank you so much for all of your views. I hope that we can keep this conversation forward between our organizations, but also if anyone else has questions, please feel free to reach out to the speakers. I'm sure they'd like to continue this conversation outside this panel as well. But thank you so much, and thank you, Isabel, for leading us through the conversation.
Framework. Our goals: knowledge sharing and capacity building among the IDFC institutions, enhanced collaboration between members and partners, and pursuing advocacy on the role of public development banks. How does it work? All year long, the club is working on contributing to the international agenda, coordinating working groups on SDGs, gender, climate, and biodiversity, releasing common strategic and operational publications, and reporting their annual commitment towards climate and biodiversity. IDFC, let's work together to implement the Sustainable Development Goals towards 2030 and beyond. What is IDFC Climate Facility? Created in 2019, the facility has been supporting